So good afternoon, welcome again, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, to an event that examines an aspect of global climate discussions which is rapidly growing in significance, the role of international law. Before we begin, a little housekeeping. Today's event will be translated into French, Spanish, and Portuguese, although we have limited capacities for Portuguese, apparently. And one of our speakers will be presenting in Portuguese. Hopefully, she will arrive. We're still waiting for Celia. And so we highly recommend the use of headsets if you need them. My name is Henry Neufeld. I lead the work on impact assessment and adaptation at the UNEP Copenhagen Climate Center. And I would like to thank Ecocide Foundation for the honor of chairing this session today. We are all aware of the influence of short-term electoral cycles in political life and how intentions and promises, funding pledges, and projects can be extremely difficult to realize in practice. This is why the contribution of law is so crucial, why international treaties and rules are required to channel truly global action. Indeed, it's why the Paris Agreement itself is so important. However, we have all witnessed and are still witnessing the painfully slow progress to fulfill that agreement. Our state host today, the Pacific Ocean Republic of Vanuatu, is probably more critically aware of this than most of us, as the effects of climate crisis are all too keenly felt across its many islands. Similarly, the indigenous peoples of Brazil are experiencing how urgent the threat to vital and climate-regulating forest biomes from industrial deforestation and pollution is. Meanwhile, young people are speaking out all over the world for more concrete and faster action on the climate crisis. All the organizations represented in this event are fully committed to expanding the use of international law in the climate context, both to protect Earth's vital ecosystems and the climate, and to ensure a safe future. I shall be introducing our speakers briefly when it is their turn to present. We anticipate that there should be time for some questions from the audience at the end, but please also feel free to approach the panelists afterwards, if they can stay, with specific queries if you don't reach them during the session. I would just like to convey apologies for two of our listed speakers. Congresswoman Talidia Petroni has not been able to join us for COP due to family reasons, and Member of European Parliament Marie Toussaint cannot be with us as her presence is now required in Brussels early tomorrow. News from the EU will therefore be covered in brief by Jojo Mida. I'll begin by thanking our co-hosts for this event, the Republic of Vanuatu, Stop Ecocide Foundation, Global Choices in the Global Greens, as well as associated partners, the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty and Youth for Ecocide Law. We'll begin with opening remarks from our state co-host, Vanuatu's Minister for Climate Change Adaptation, Energy, Environment, Meteorology, Geohazards, and Disaster Management, the Honorable Ralph Regenvanu. Mr. Regenvanu, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, and welcome everyone to this event. It's a very important event when we're talking about negotiation that sometimes seems to go nowhere. It's good to have an event talking about legal remedies as well. Thank you to the co-hosts of this event with Vanuatu. Vanuatu, as has been mentioned by OMC, very small archipelago of islands in the Southwest Pacific, classified by the United Nations as one of the countries most at risk from natural hazards. And that at-risk classification is due to the intensity of the climate change impacts, as well as our limited capacity to respond and be resilient as a result of our categorization as one of the least developed countries of the world. The climate crisis that we are suffering from, we have no part in its cause, maybe 0.00016% of emissions historically from Vanuatu, yet we're on the front lines of the impacts which are making being safe now a very rare commodity in my country. To be safe with your family in your own home from all of these impacts we're experiencing. So for Vanuatu, these negotiations here, the issue of climate change, is really one centered around accountability and justice. These effects were caused by others who need to be accountable and help us. And it's an issue of justice as well. And so when we come to COP year after year and are frustrated by the lack of accountability and the lack of justice that is coming from those countries that should be accountable and should be creating justice for the rest of us, we have to consider options beyond the UNFCCC process, options that will help to strengthen the UNFCCC process, and that's what we are here to talk about today. And Vanuatu has decided to take a number of options to help the UNFCCC process and move beyond the UNFCCC process. In 2019, we became the first country to call for recognition of the crime of ecocide under the Rome Statute at the International Criminal Court. We wanted to see the people who caused massive destruction of the environment held accountable and brought to justice. And that's what ecocide is about. And I'm glad that that call is gaining momentum around the world. And we look forward to its realization not only in national jurisdictions, as is happening now, but at the International Criminal Court eventually. That's the aim. Vanuatu was also the first country to call for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty last year at the United Nations General Assembly. We need to phase out fossil fuels. We all know that. Apparently the presidency doesn't think there's any science behind it, but the world knows, and the science shows that we have to phase out fossil fuels and phase out fossil fuel subsidies. And we came to this COP to get the F word into the negotiated outcome. And if we do get the F word in there, we're going to need a strategy. And this is it. The Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty is a strategy that is a legally negotiated international instrument on how we can together go on that path of phasing down, phasing out fossil fuels in a way that is fair, equitable, and just for all of us. Those who produce fossil fuels, those who've never produced fossil fuels and suffer from it, and everyone in between. And the third legal avenue Vanuatu's been instrumental in is the call on the International Court of Justice to issue an advisory opinion on the obligations of states when it comes to the effects of climate change on the environment, on present and future generations. And after a 3-year campaign that was initiated by law students in my country, Vanuatu, who came and said, we think this is the best way legally to address the issue of climate change, and the government of Vanuatu agreed and took it up through the forum to the international community, and after years of diplomatic efforts, in March this year we got a vote at the United Nations General Assembly. The first time there's been an ICJ advisory opinion voted on by consensus at the United Nations. So the ICJ will now be considering this question. Submissions are due by January. We'll hear more about that on this panel. But we're hoping to get, by maybe 2 years' time, a strong advisory opinion that says, yes, states that sign up to UNFCCC, that sign up to CEDAW, that sign up to United Nations rights of child, that sign up to all these conventions on political rights and human rights, are accountable for what they've signed. And they are legally obligated to do what they signed up to do. And once we get that, I think that will strengthen the hundreds of cases that are already happening throughout the world, and will also help UNFCCC here, because it'll provide guardrails to what kind of language you can use here. It'll provide legal clarity to all these terms you talk about at UNFCCC. about responsibilities and accountabilities. And so that's why these avenues are so important in this context of COP. I think I'll finish here, and I want to apologize because I have to go off to another event. But I wish all of you a very good discussion, and let's keep these initiatives going, and let's build support for them, because this is something that is going to help us get where we want to get. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Minister Ralph, for this really important statement. Let me just repeat one of the sentences that he said. Accountability and justice, that is what ecocide is about. And I think it really says it all. We can't only rely on the UNFCCC, which is a weak institution in the sense that it cannot implement or enforce anything, but laws and legal definitions, they can. They actually make people and institutions change. So, without further ado, we will look at each of these legal initiatives in turn. Let's begin with the Fossil Fuel Treaty. With us today is Sephora Berman. She is an award-winning author, government policy advisor, and environmental campaigner. She is the International Program Director at Stand Earth, as well as the chair and founder of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. In 2019, she was awarded the Climate Breakthrough Award, and in 2021, she gave a widely viewed TED Talk presenting the case for a global treaty to phase out fossil fuels. The movement around the initiative has not stopped growing since. Ms. Berman, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. It's wonderful to be here with all of you, and especially with this incredible panel. You know, it's a really good day when a sitting minister steals all your best lines about the fossil fuel treaty. It's, but that experience, listening to Minister Reginald speak about the fossil fuel treaty, is what's amazingly happening right now. For the last 3 years, it's been a proposal from lawyers and diplomats and experts from around the world, from civil society. And the reason, in part, that we started creating it was because all of the work around the world, from indigenous people standing on the front lines, from community groups standing on the front lines to oppose project after project that are killing us. And yet when I met with governments to talk to them about constraining fossil fuels, I was told that that's not a climate issue. That there wasn't a policy pathway to keep it in the ground. Why? Because for decades, the fossil fuel industry has had a strategy. And that strategy has been to decouple emissions from production, to make fossil fuels invisible in climate policy negotiations and international agreements, and that's what they've done. To such an extent that the Paris Agreement doesn't even include the words oil, gas, coal, or fossil fuels. So building on the incredible work of South Pacific Island nations with their proposals for the Suva Declaration in 2014, a number of us got together a couple of years ago and said, what would it look like? Imagine if we had a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, modeled in part after nuclear non-proliferation treaties, because there was a time when countries thought that stockpiling nuclear weapons was what was going to keep us safe. And it was because of the campaigns against stockpiling nuclear weapons that countries started to understand that stockpiling 6 times as many bombs that could blow up the planet 6 times over wasn't what kept us safe, it's what threatened us. Today, the expansion of fossil fuels is what threatens us. The idea that we don't have any agreements right now between our countries to manage who gets to produce and how much, even though the science is very clear that we cannot continue fossil fuel expansion if we want to keep the world safe, is absurd. Last month, the United Nations Environment Program and the Stockholm Environment Institute put out the Production Gap Report. And in that report, it shows that we are on track to produce 110% more oil, gas, and coal between now and 2030 than we can ever burn, or it will burn us. So what do we do now? We know that demand is going to peak within the next couple of years and go down because of all of you fighting for zero-emission vehicles, for zero-emission buildings, all of the great policies that we need to reduce demand. We have to reduce demand, but if we're not also cutting supply, we're trying to cut with only one half of the scissors. And it won't work, because what we build today is what we will use tomorrow. So that's why we've been designing the principles underneath which countries will begin to design a fossil fuel treaty. A treaty that will ensure that the wind down of fossil fuel production and emissions happens in a way that is equitable, happens in a way that is fair, happens in a way that is managed. We know we're going to use less fossil fuels, and we have to produce less fossil fuels if we're going to survive, because this stuff is complicated. But what's not is 86% of the emissions trapped in our atmosphere today come from three things. They come from oil, gas, and coal. So we know we have to constrain those three products. And right now, production is increasing. We have to align production with demand destruction. We have to, because it's not good enough just to build the good stuff. It's great that we're getting commitments to triple renewables here at COP. But 10 years ago, 80% of the energy we used on this planet came from fossil fuels. Today, 80% of the energy we use comes from fossil fuels. Because we build more and more renewable energy, but we also build more and more fossil fuels. So we have to stop the expansion of fossil fuels, and that's the first pillar of the treaty. We have to stop the expansion. The second pillar of the treaty, manage the wind down in a way that is equitable and fair. Because you know, right now, who manages, who gets to produce and how much is the marketplace and OPEC. Because climate policy has been built on a theory that if demand goes down and the price of carbon goes up, if renewables are cheaper and all of those things are happening, then the markets will constrain supply. But it's not working. It's not working fast enough to keep us safe. And that's because the market's distorted by fossil fuel subsidies. The IMF reports $13 million a minute right now in fossil fuel subsidies. And subsidies went up this year. Why are fossil fuel subsidies going up? Because every country knows we will use less oil, but they all want to be the last barrel sold. So they're all protecting their own industries, especially the wealthy countries. And it is the wealthy countries that have to stop first. And if countries like Ecuador are going to stop drilling for oil in the heart of the Amazon, they're going to need support. They're going to need debt relief, tax agreements, trade agreements, and it's those types of mechanisms that we're now exploring underneath a fossil fuel treaty. So what happens now? We now have 10 nation states that have endorsed the call for a fossil fuels treaty and are beginning to pursue a negotiating mandate. Yesterday, President Petro of Colombia announced that Colombia was the most recent nation to call for a fossil fuel treaty. The day before, Palau joined the fossil fuel treaty. By the end of COP, there will be more. Those nation states are now the nation states that will begin to design the treaty. The Fossil Fuel Treaty Secretariat is here to support them, to provide the information that they need in order to understand what legal mechanisms and new global governance do we need. Because we have to create something new. Some people say that this idea is too big, it's too bold. But what we know here at COP is we don't have time for more of the same. For 30 years, we've missed our targets. For 30 years, every year we make commitments here at COP and then emissions go up. Why? Because we keep building more and more of what we know is killing us. 5 million people died this year just from lethal heat alone. 7 million people died this year from air pollution predominantly due to fossil fuels. Today, fossil fuels are our weapons of mass destruction. But the good thing is we don't need them anymore. Renewables are cheaper. We can do this, but we can only do it if we do it together. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. We don't have time for more of the same. I think that's just really important to recognize, and we need these bold initiatives like the non-fossil fuel proliferation treaty. So let's all work to make this happen. Thank you. We now move, no, this is the wrong statement because, well, actually it's the right one because Celia isn't here. So we'll just continue with Jojo. We now move to the area of criminal law. Jojo Mida, our next speaker, is chair of the Stop Ecocide Foundation. She founded Stop Ecocide in 2017 alongside legal pioneer, the late Polly Higgins, to support recognition of ecocide, that is mass damage and destruction of nature, as a crime at the International Criminal Court. As key spokesperson and executive director, she has overseen the remarkable growth of the movement internationally while coordinating between legal developments, diplomatic traction, and public narrative. As chair of the charitable Stop Ecocide Foundation, Ms. Mida was also convener of the independent expert panel for the legal definition of ecocide chaired by Philip Sands, KC, and Dr. Falsau. Ms. Mida will speak to us on the subject of sanctioning the severest harms to nature and the relevance to climate crisis, and update us on the progress of the Ecocide Law Initiative. Ms. Mida, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And before I begin, I would just like to say we have had a message through from Celia Chacriaba to say that she has been elected to speak at the official delegation board. I'm guessing that's for Brazil. And this is the first time that an Indigenous person has been invited to speak in this position. So we completely applaud her for choosing that event over this one. So just wanted to let you know that. Also to let you know that Inga, who will be speaking after me, will be speaking about the Arctic and the moratorium on exploitation in the Arctic, not the ICJ advisory opinion, just to correct that. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for being here today. In the face of a crisis of civilizational, thank you, proportions, it can be genuinely difficult to know what to do. We are not, as we've already heard, culturally equipped to address it. The Western economic and political systems that have come to dominate the globe have been built on beliefs that we know intellectually are quite obviously incorrect. For example, the belief that we can treat nature as an infinite bank of resources, or that extraction from one ecosystem or species population doesn't affect others, or indeed affect us. I don't need to enumerate here the ways in which such beliefs have proven destructive and dangerous. Scientists have been telling us this for decades, and Indigenous voices have been telling us it for centuries. The truth is that our awakening awareness is in conflict with our deeply established economic, political, and educational systems embedded over many generations. Culture takes a long time to evolve and change, and we know, as we've heard, and this is a theme, time is not a luxury we have. In these circumstances, and again, this is very much the focus of this event, we must first look to create safety. Safety doesn't come from knowing exactly what to do. It comes from setting key rules in place about what not to do. And it turns out those things we should not do are actually pretty simple. We've just heard from Sepra Berman with respect to ending expansion of fossil fuels. We will hear soon from Inga Ralph with regard to protecting the Arctic. And as an outer parameter to support and enforce these and indeed all multilateral environmental agreements, it is imperative that we recognize ecocide as a serious crime at all levels, national, regional, and especially international. Criminal law is crucially important because it is the way we define what is unacceptable and what is dangerous. We would not dream of asking a government for a license to kill a few hundred people for our new infrastructure project, whether or not it will eventually do so. It would not only be criminal, we would consider it criminally insane. but we do not recoil in the same way from threatening horrific environmental damage via industrial activity or industrial negligence, much of which damage is already in breach of regulations, rights frameworks, or safety protocols, and much of which directly exacerbates global heating through destruction of vital climate-regulating ecosystems and carbon sinks. It is clear that we should have a similar taboo around such harms, and an international crime of ecocide creates the foundation for this. A board of directors will approach its environmental obligations very differently, knowing that if it fails to fulfill them and commits ecocide as a result, its members could be held criminally responsible. A crime of ecocide provides a double level of deterrence. Not only would personal freedom and reputation be at stake, but also the reputation and, crucially, the stock value of the company. This legal initiative is already gaining rapid momentum around the world, and defining ecocide as an international crime has proved to be a key milestone. The drafting project, convened by our charitable foundation, was carried out in 2021 by an independent expert panel of top lawyers from around the world, representing a profound depth of legal expertise, as well as a broad range of experience and ideology. The result is clear, balanced, and concise, and you will find it on the postcard on your seat. Ecocide means unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. It is fundamentally important that this is a definition that focuses not on particular behaviours, but on consequences. This ensures the crime will remain relevant into the future. It does not demonise any specific industry or sector, but instead sets an outer guardrail to prevent severe and widespread or long-term harm wherever and whenever it is threatened. It thus provides a framework to steer healthy decisions and a lens through which policymakers and boards of directors can look to assess which strategic changes will be needed in the face of the approaching law. This definition has catalysed political discussion and proposals of law around the world, with several submitted into national parliaments already this year, including in Brazil, as we would have been hearing in more detail from Célia Chacriaba, whose party it was that proposed the ecocide bill over there. In a highly significant development just 2 weeks ago, the European Parliament, Commission and Council reached political agreement to include environmental offences comparable to ecocide into the revised EU Environmental Crimes Directive, meaning that 27 countries must now harmonise with this over the next 2 years in their own penal codes. Special mention should be made at this point of Member of the European Parliament, Marie Toussaint of the Greens EFA Group. Marie is sadly not able to join us today due to urgent EU commitments, but her team has actively driven developments on ecocide at the EU for several years, ensuring that it has been recognised as a truly cross-party issue. It is entirely appropriate that today's event is co-hosted by the Global Greens, who have wholeheartedly endorsed the ecocide law initiative around the world. This EU agreement is a huge step towards recognition of ecocide at the global level, at the International Criminal Court, where for some years now it has been under ever-growing discussion. Ecocide as a Rome Statute crime will once more be the subject of events and diplomatic meetings next week at the ICC's annual assembly, taking place at the UN in New York. In conclusion, what we are seeing here is a clear legislative direction of travel being established, and it is moving quite fast, which is encouraging. Our organisation is here to help facilitate this conversation at all levels. So if a detailed briefing would be of use to your delegation or to your particular network, we will be delighted to support. For organisational allies in the room, if you are keen to work closely with us at high level, we have booked a meeting room here at COP for 2 p.m. tomorrow to discuss developments, so please talk to us outside after the event. We look forward to continuing to collaborate with governments, as well as with civil society, on a rapid and just transition from climate crisis to planetary security, guided by the right laws. Thank you.
Thank you, Jojo. Criminal law is meant to define what is unacceptable and what is dangerous. And a crime of ecocide is the foundation for that. It really will determine how institutions, actors, boards, countries operate at the national, international, and subnational levels. It will filter down from the international all the way to the local courts. And I think that's such a promising idea, and we really hope that it will make as much progress in the future as it has in the past. So thank you for that. And to our next speaker, we now shift focus on an area of the planet that has particular significance in the climate context, and that is the Arctic. With us today is Inge Ralph. She is co-founder and executive director of Global Choices, urging protection for Earth's Arctic ice shield and climate stabilizer by calling for a 10-year moratorium to protect the central Arctic ocean ice and have it recognized as a global commons. A thought leader and policy innovator around systems change and global governance, Inge has advised governments internationally and was policy advisor to the elders during the landmark Paris COP and the SDG agreements. Female-led, Global Choices mentors a global female youth leadership network of 60 Arctic angels, climate leaders active in 27 countries, educating on the ice crisis. Ms. Ralph, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that. Sitting here and reflecting how wonderful it is, to be sitting here amongst heroes of mine. And just thinking about this moment in time and how different it is. It's quite right that policy and lawmaking has tended to be glacial. Unfortunately, we can't even use that expression anymore because glacial is now fast moving. But it actually is ironic that it is fast moving because in a lot of the sort of spiritual traditions, there is something called interdependent arising, which means that there are multiple factors coming together at one time. And you can almost feel tangibly that we are now in a place where these multiple factors are coming together. And I think it's a confluence of tremendous change ahead of us, which is, I find very, very exciting, having sort of, like many of you, it's felt like pushing water uphill with a rake for years and years and years. But things are happening fast. And it is happening because of innovators. And, Ecocide, your non-proliferation treaty, the youth network works. These are all relatively recent but very bold innovations. And I have long felt that we have to approach climate with the same sort of entrepreneurial spirit as we do business. I mean, heavens, business is being incentivized left, right, and center to be entrepreneurial. We need to incentivize the climate movement to be entrepreneurial and take risks because we don't have time. Now, when I put my pin on this morning, which was the SDG 14 for life underwater, I felt really quite sad that it's life underwater. It had a different connotation, as we've heard from Minister Regenvanu, that so many people will be underwater, and particularly will be underwater if we lose the Arctic ice and Antarctic ice and the Greenland ice sheets. And I honestly never thought I'd be up here advocating for protection of the Arctic ice. I like penguins and polar bears as much as anyone else, but really when we did a deep dive, Sally and I, into what it is in the climate world that is strategically critical to do, it is that we do need to protect the Arctic ice, and we are in an ice crisis. Over 2 decades, we have lost 28 trillion tons of ice. And that is directly, there is a total correlation. And if you I think you've got some postcards on your seats, there's a QR code which is to our brief. You'll see there's a direct correlate between the ppms and the ice loss. And the Arctic and Antarctic is warming 3 to 4 times faster than anywhere else on Earth. So if you want to understand what going over 1.5 looks like, just look and see what's happening there. And the consequences are significant. I mean, for every 1 centimetre of sea level rise, about 2 to 3 million people will be affected by variable flooding. Now, that's centimetres. When we're talking about potential sea level rise, we're talking in metres, so you go and do the maths. But I think the important thing is, okay, what are we going to do? And we looked at this and we looked at how crazy it is that there is no real understanding. And we're talking here about the Central Arctic Ocean, which is an area beyond national jurisdiction. Not the Arctic writ large, they all have different types of regulation. But the Central Arctic Ocean, as an area beyond national jurisdiction, really should be a global commons. It belongs to all of us. And of course, the Sami indigenous community would be affected. But a Samoan is underwater and loses their home. Where are their voices in this? So we really also need to look at new models of governance of these spaces that are much more inclusive, that take into account indigenous voices, that take into account youth voices, that take into account those who are most affected. Because while it was all frozen, it was fine. Who cared? You know, it was the province of scientists and explorers. But this is very, very real. I would say it's probably the biggest existential threat amongst the climate systems that we are facing. So we need to address that, and we need to address it fast. Now, as we know, the law is not a fast-moving thing, generally, unless you've got Polly and people like these pushing it. But it generally is pretty slow. So we reckon that in the interim, and I mean, the BBNJ took, 16, 17 years to get across the line? And, you know, fingers crossed, it'll be quite quick in being ratified. But then it's still got to be implemented. In the meantime, we don't have time. So we decided to call for a 10-year moratorium that just puts a precautionary principle pause on harm of that space. Because if we allow, it's a bit like saying, well, you know, we'll protect the Amazon, we'll plant trees, but let's cut down the Amazon. We have to do these things in tandem. So we absolutely have to protect what we can while we can. What are we protecting against? Well, of course, as the ice melts, commercial interests and state interests are hovering to pile in there to exploit for deep sea mining, there's very rich in mineral nodules, oil and gas. Let's have a transpolar shipping route. Why shouldn't we? So we can ship oil and gas faster and across the poles. It's insane, especially when you think of how unique this biome is and how little we know about it. There is so little known what's under that ice, but we do know that there are like 26,000 unique species in the Arctic. We also know it's absolutely critical to the whole global system. We know it's critical to keeping us cool. We also know that it's critical for the entire circulatory system. So let's protect it while we can. And so we have had, over the summer, a team of lawyers working, including, we've got a couple of our Arctic Angels here, who are the legal experts who've been working with experts across the world. So they've been mentored by them, and they've been doing the drafting. And this is why we genuinely believe in what real intergenerational work means, is that you have this exchange. And it's been so rich, and they have come up with this wonderful, wonderful draft moratorium, and the preamble of which really takes us forward. And I'm going to just mention a couple of pieces from this preamble, because it's obviously recognizing the profound anthropogenic, I've also got that problem, too little sleep, and the exploitation and the alarm of the loss of the ice. But it's in pursuit of, and this is what the heading is of this whole panel, a just and peaceful world, and recognizing the rights and interests of current and future generations. We have to change the language of law to be both a moral and a practical in essence. And that it's, the Arctic is much more than just this place-based system. It is actually something that will be irrecoverable in our lifetimes. If we lose this, there is pretty much no recovery system. So however much geoengineering thinks they can fix it, we haven't seen anything yet that can do that. To protect the unique biome, but also the key piece of this is the moral and legal imperative to protect the well-being and rights of present and future generations. There is legal language for this already in the UN, but we need to bring it all together and to uphold intergenerational equity and ecological integrity. Now, there are lots of really good things that are in this interdependent arising. We've just had the Kunming Treaty, and we've got the BBNJ happening. We've got some very interesting things happening in the business world requiring transparency. So it's bringing that in, and just to have, in the spirit of promoting this ecological integrity, safeguarding human rights and advancing environmental justice, we commit to a 10-year moratorium, a precautionary approach on exploitative activity that harms the ice shield of the Central Arctic Ocean, subject to the conditions, and then there's a whole bunch of conditions. But here's the bit that I think we miss so often in law. It becomes so technical and legalese and hard, and we miss the heart of what we're talking about. And you are all here, we are all here, because we feel deeply connected. We understand that we are nature. We're not separate from nature, we're not separate from one another. So may this agreement serve as a beacon of hope and as an affirmation of our multilateral commitment to build a resilient, just, and sustainable world for all generations. Let it inspire individuals, organizations, and nations to embrace their shared responsibility to this world. May it serve as an example of the global community aspiring to the highest common good and acting on legal obligations and acknowledging a moral imperative to safeguard the earth. And that, I think, is the essence of a feminine energy. And it's very interesting here, you have a platform of females, but it's not females. We have Ralph, we have men who also have this feminine energy. And what is the essence of the feminine energy? That we put self aside for the common good. And I think we're beginning to see all of this playing out in our world. And thank you all for being part of that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Inge. So, as they say, when you're in a hole, first stop digging. And the Arctic being among the most fragile ecosystems in the world, and us knowing so little about it, I really think it is important to stop digging and stop using it, not least because we don't understand how it affects all the systems, ecosystems, the people living in it. And we have this moral imperative to ensure that not only we, but also future generations can benefit from all the good things and the wonderful things that this planet Earth has to offer. So with that, we're now moving to this topic of the future, more specifically, youth. It is the young, those who are young today and future generations who will have to deal with the mess that we are leaving them if we do not act boldly on climate change now. Vanessa Nakati is a climate activist from Uganda and UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador. She was the first Fridays for Future Climate Activist in Uganda, and founder of the Rise Up climate movement, which aims to amplify the voices of activists from Africa. Vanessa spearheaded the campaign to save Congo's rainforest, which is facing massive deforestation. She is also the author of A Bigger Picture, a manifesto on inclusive climate action. She is one of the world's best-known faces in the global youth climate movement and has addressed world leaders on multiple occasions. As UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador, Vanessa is especially speaking up for the children in the context of this global crisis. Ms. Nakati, we look forward to your perspective on climate action, climate justice, and the need for these legal strategies. Please, the floor is yours.
Yeah. Thank you so much. At the beginning of the COP, we saw the operationalization of the Loss and Damage Fund. And for many of us, this was a moment of excitement. And we started to see pledges coming towards that fund. And then the excitement increased. And many of the people were, asking questions about how this was a win for COP28, even at the very first day. Today, a Guardian article revealed that the president of COP28, Sultan Al-Jaber, has claimed there is no science indicating that a phase-out of fossil fuels is needed to restrict global heating to 1.5 degrees Celsius. This is unacceptable. This reveals who holds the power in these spaces, and that is the fossil fuel industry. We know that the fossil fuel industry has for decades held so much power in the COP process, and we need to dismantle that power and hand the power back to the people. When I read this article, it made me see what the hidden agenda of this COP is. Because the COP presidency doesn't believe that there is science that indicates that a phase out of fossil fuels is needed to restrict global heating to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The latest IPCC reports say that we must halve emissions by 2030 in order to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. But how can we do this without the phase out of fossil fuels? They account for more than 75% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. And simply put, they are the problem. So we may celebrate the pledges coming in for loss and damage. We may celebrate what is coming in for adaptation. But if we don't address the root cause of the climate crisis, then all of this is a distraction. Fossil fuels are fueling this crisis, and in the process, they're killing people and destroying our planet. The IEA has made it very clear that if we want to have a fighting chance of 1.5 degrees Celsius, we cannot have any new fossil fuel developments. The UN Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, has repeatedly said that any new investments in fossil fuels would be moral and economic madness. So why are we allowing the moral and economic madness that is taking place right now? When I read the article, I realized that we've actually been quite comfortable the past days of the COP. And this article, in a way, woke me up and realized that actually the COP has just started, if this is what the article is saying. The climate crisis is affecting so many people in different parts of the world. I have seen that in some of the areas that I've visited, like Turkana in the Horn of Africa. And I've seen how this crisis has left millions of people on the brink of starvation. I've seen how children, mothers, families are being impacted by the climate crisis. So it's important that when we talk about this crisis, we don't just talk about its statistics. We talk about people. Because when you read an article like that, you only think about the people that are already suffering some of the worst impacts of the crisis. We've seen this year that we've had the hottest year ever. We've seen disasters in different parts of the world. We've seen how thousands of people died in Libya, but how the world moved on so fast from that. We saw how thousands died in Pakistan, but we moved on so fast from that. We saw how thousands died in 2019 in the southern parts of the African continent after Cyclone Idai, and yet the world quickly moved on from that. We cannot afford to be silent. We cannot afford to be comfortable. We must speak up and mobilize for our communities, for frontline communities. Like I said, I personally realized today that I have been very comfortable, especially from the first day of the COP that gave us this excitement of the loss and damage fund, and all of us saw this as a win. But now, when you read an article where the presidency of the COP says that he doesn't believe there is any science behind phasing out fossil fuels, then we should be worried, we should be disturbed, and we shouldn't be comfortable. Because now the real agenda of the COP is being revealed. I believe that in order to hold leaders accountable and drive real climate action, we must speak up, we must organize, we must mobilize, we must speak truth to power. As much as we celebrate the wins, we should be able to see through the distractions and call the reality that is happening right now, that this is a space that has been sabotaged by the fossil fuel industry. We also need to expand the use of legal avenues, like you've heard from my fellow panelists, to address the climate crisis. Like Vanuatu's initiative at the UN International Court of Justice, like the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, and the recognition of ecocide, the mass damage and destruction of nature, as a crime at the International Criminal Court. So my ask for all of us in this space is to leave this room knowing that there are a lot of interests at play here. Many of these interests are national interests, but not interests of humanity, not interests of the people. I want us to leave knowing that we must have got the operationalization of the fund, but we have not yet addressed the elephant in the room, and that is fossil fuels. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa, for these very clear remarks. I think, why are we allowing the moral and economic madness to continue? Profitability, power. It's certainly not in the interest of the people, and those who are suffering are those who are powerless and vulnerable, and those who haven't caused the problem. So the legal instruments that we've been talking about here are really, really critical and instrumental to solving part of and being part of the solution that we are striving for. Now, I'd like to ask the panelists to give a short 1-2 minute statement at the end of this session, and then we'll have time for some questions. Thanks. So we'll start the far end this time and then move our way forward. Vanessa, please go ahead.
Well, I think I've said what I had to say. I don't have anything right.
That's okay. We heard the message. That was pretty clear. We'll have more questions. You'll get more chance to talk, I'm sure. So, Inga, please.
I come from the corporate world, and we've often had to look at major transitions and the nature of transition. And the nature of transition is there is always a massive push me, pull you situation where people hang on to wanting to keep the status quo, and then we've got the innovation and the new, and it's a massive tug. And I think we're in just that sort of time right now. We're in this massive transition space. Without question, all our leaders are walking on thin ice. And that we have to understand that we are actually all ice-dependent species. It's not just humans, but it's the whole ecosystem on which we depend, the animals, the natural system too. We still have everything to fight for. And let's not think that we have to always rely on the COP or those leaders. We have phenomenal agency, and this is what we're seeing is shifting things. So hang on to that agency. Nelson Mandela, who was the chair of the elders, always used to say, it's never over until it's actually done. And I think we can get there.
Thank you. That's a hopeful message. Sipora, please.
I think one of the things I love about this panel is that we're talking so clearly about the issues that seem so obscured in climate policy, but also talking about legal mechanisms to build the world that we want. Because we know we have to stop building the bad stuff. We've got to start building the good stuff. But what's been lacking, I think, so much for a long time is a vision of pathways to start building. The really organizing groups of people around ideas, that's the grunt work of social change. It's hard. But we have to think about what we're doing as kind of like a funnel, So I feel like that at the Fossil Fuel Treaty Secretariat. We've created an idea, and it's our job to help nation states build it. We won't get more nation states to join it, and we won't get the momentum that those countries need to step out and do the courageous thing and point out that we need to stop expansion of fossil fuels and create this mechanism to do it, unless people start organizing. And so I don't see the Fossil Fuel Treaty just as a legal mechanism, just as another treaty. I also see it as a way to bring our movements together. And one of the things that just gives me hope, it makes me, after 30 years of doing this work, excited every day to turn on my computer, is that we've thrown this idea out into the world, but no one owns it. It's an idea. We think of ourselves as a distributed network campaign, and every day our little core team is trying to encourage more people to take it up and work in any way that it works in your circumstance, because no one can tell you exactly how to talk about this, exactly how to build political pressure in your region, in your country, than you, right? The way that we talk about fossil fuels in Malaysia is going to be different than the way that I talk about fossil fuels in Canada. It's going to be different than the way that you do in Uganda. So we have to, but I think one of the main problems in the climate movement for 30 years is that our work is like spaghetti on a wall. Is that saying transfer? No, in different languages, probably doesn't. We kind of throw everything out and see what sticks. It's like, there's too many ideas, and the fact is, we are so much more powerful together. And fossil fuels, as you've heard from this panel, and I think many of you in this room know, maybe the president at COP doesn't know, but we know where a lot of where the problem lies. And so having one big key demand, a fossil fuel treaty that can be and also ecocide for sure, because these big demands we can build movements around them, and we are building movements around them. There are 3,000 organizations that have now endorsed the fossil fuel treaty. I don't even know in how many countries. Our website's been translated into 18 languages, not by us. The other day I met the fossil fuel treaty group in Mexico. I didn't even know we had a fossil fuel treaty group in Mexico. The World Health Organization has endorsed. Thousands of faith leaders have endorsed. It's an incredible journey, and I think it's because people are inspired to have a demand, a goal that is commensurate with the scale of the problem, where whether or not you live in the Amazon or whether or not you live in Uganda or Canada, you can know that you're on the same team. And it's a team that is aspiring to tell the truth, to cut through all of the language and the bad math. The terms unabated and abated, the terms efficient, inefficient. Today I even heard, it's true, we agree that there should be no new fossil fuel projects, but in fact, what we have to be clear on is it's no net new fossil fuel projects. The IEA has actually changed its report, so it no longer says no new, it says no net new. These are the words that just camouflage the need for actual change, the hard stuff. Stop building it. Yes, our society has depended on it for the last 50 years. We have, many of us have benefited from the fossil fuel era, and we didn't know. We didn't know when we were building this industrial infrastructure that it was also going to be what was threatening us and what was killing us, poisoning our air, our waters, threatening our stable climate. Now we know. Now we know. And we have the capacity to change, but only if we have the courage to confront it. And that courage is so much easier if we're together on big, bold demands like this, because the great thing about courage is that courage is contagious. Thank you.
Thank you. Jojo.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, a lot of it's been said, but I think this definitely feels like the reality check panel. Like what actually is happening and what needs to be done. I think the thing that's Sepra is also touching on is, the power of advocacy. Now, we all get that when it's the fossil fuel companies doing it. We go, yeah, they pay their lobbyists, and their lobbyists talk to the governments, and they influence legislation. It's like people understand that that's how that works. But that's how this works too. But we just don't pay for expensive meals and all of that stuff because we don't have any cash, But effectively, it's the power of conversation. It's the power of, as Sepra was saying, people coming together and saying something. And I think that the other aspect that she brought out that I think is so important and that characterizes each of these three legal avenues is total specificity. Because, I've been to, so many of you will have been to so many of these things, and we hear lots of incredible initiatives and lots of kind of 5-point plans to save the world and lots of political programs that cover a whole bunch of things, and that's all very well and good. But my sense is that one of the reasons that these things have been progressing quite fast is because they're very, very specific. I like to use the metaphor of kind of drawing a pen through water. It's very thin at the front end, so it's hard to, you don't hit up against so many obstacles, but behind you make a hell of a wake. And I have a feeling that that's what these initiatives are doing, and that's very exciting. And that kind of connectivity around a specific thing, I think, is extremely powerful. I know Sepra's kind of already said it, but I wanted to bring my little pen metaphor in. Anyway, so I'll leave it there. But I know that Inga had a couple more words she wanted to add.
Yeah, just very quickly, because it struck me here, sitting here, just the other piece of this. They absolutely said so beautifully about courage, about collaboration. But it's also about inspiration. And I have to say that every single one of the people on this panel and what they've done has been an inspiration for us. And they've been genuinely open and supportive and willing to share, which I think is a very big shift from the old model of being competitive. It is that the time for competition is long gone. And this collaboration, but also this generosity of spirit that comes with that. And the fact, that here, these are my contacts. Why don't you use this? This is the person we can connect you with. Let's make this happen, and that's how it happens fast. And I just want to say thank you to, my three fellow panelists here, because it's been a huge inspiration to us at Global Choices.
Thank you. So we still have time for questions. Do we have a roving mic here somewhere? Okay, that's good, because otherwise I would have to repeat the question. We have a question here. I'll take 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, that's going to be hard for me to keep track of. So we'll take these 3 questions here, and then we'll come back to you 3 here. Okay? Please, go ahead. State your name, where you come from. Yeah, please.
Thank you so much for talking to us. My name is Maria Anaya. I am a Colombian PhD student at Cornell University. When Sephora, she was talking about the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, I was thinking that, with Kyoto, the United States didn't join, and the United States was, is one of the most, emitters in the world. So I was wondering whether you think something similar could happen with the non-proliferation treaty, in the sense that, for example, some of states that have or dominate the fossil fuel industry wouldn't want to join the treaty. What kind of strategies could civil society, non-state actors, or even from academia could do to actually push these governments to join the treaty in the future? Thank you.
Can you pass, who was the next person who had raised their hand? Let's do the 3 questions quickly, if that's okay. So we have this gentleman here with the T-shirt, blue, white, and then, yes, I got you. Yes, thanks.
My name is Angelika Clausen, and I'm the European President of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, and also the German President. And my colleague is here from MEDECT and from Nepal. And we have experiences with such treaty. We were one of the founders of ICANN. And ICANN, in 10 years, we had ICANN getting a Nobel Prize, and then 4 years later, it went into I don't know the English word, you know it. And I want to tell a short story. Yesterday evening in the television, before sleeping, I saw a small German TV movie on climate, and there was a discussion between a very famous German climate scientist, his name is Oji Blativ, and the Extinction Rebellion. And then there was this discussion, why did Extinction Rebellion did not succeed with their actions, and why were they criminalized? And Moji Blativ, it's a wonderful person, but he was really, you could feel his helplessness and see his helplessness. And he always said, I said so many things. For 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, I taught everything, but it didn't come true. And now these climate activists, Fridays for Future, even did do it. So what can I do now? And this was a question that was not answered in the TV show, but how our brain functions. I'm a psychiatrist and psychotherapist, and how difficult this is for people to change, for men to change. And hearing you...
Could you please
I'm come to the end. Hearing the 4 women here, you are so clear. Your language is so clear. Your message is so clear. And the way you talk, one wants to come to you and say, yeah, let's do it together. We find some more people. We find some more organization. Because you are so clear. And let's do it together, and let's stay this clear and work for this treaty. I think it's wonderful.
Thank you very much for that statement. Yes, please, sir.
Thanks very much. My name is Chidi Oti Obihara. I'm a former non-executive director of the Green Party of England and Wales. I work with Jojo and Stop Ecocide International. I'm Senior Research Fellow 2022 at Project Drawdown. That's how Zafora and I have met. I also sit on the board of SBTI, the Science-Based Target Initiative that helps corporates transition. And I cannot thank all of the panel enough, including and especially Vanessa, for that amazing outline of female energy, as you guys described it, in dealing with a long-running problem. But I want to narrow it down, actually, to an analogy that I really liked, because Zafora drew an analogy between nuclear non-proliferation and fossil fuel non-proliferation. And to expand that, to amplify that, I'm old enough to remember the 70s, where we all knew we were going to die if we carried on expanding nuclear weapons and pointing them at each other. But it was a different type of game. In a game theoretical sense, it was different because we knew who the parties were. There were two sides. It was simple in that sense. Fossil fuels are complicated because there are so many players. It's non-specific. It's very, very hard to narrow down what it is exactly you do that calls time on the fight. How do you tell everyone it's time to stop and be equitable when it's such a big melee? You know, it's everyone throwing stuff at once. And that's one of the reasons why I'm really attracted to the idea of Stop Ecocide International, because fossil fuel use is ultimately the most ecocidal thing you can do. It ends life on the planet by triggering tipping points that you, Inga, were mentioning. But I wanted to challenge Zafora. If you could do the same thing that we did in 1989, where the Berlin Wall fell and we put away all these nuclear weapons by bringing, for example, the Russians and the Americans together. If you could do the same thing, if you could bring the Saudis, the Americans, and the Russians, for example, the fossil fuel superpowers, if you could bring them together and force them to sign an ecocide law that limited their proliferation of fossil fuels, would you do it?
Okay, great question. So we have 3 questions, maybe 2.5 questions, and some responses. Who wants to go first, please? Support.
Thank you. Let me take the question around the big countries, or the countries, and especially the ones who are producers, not joining. We don't expect them to. We don't even want them to. Because what we're trying to do is not create a universal treaty in the way that is with the UNFCCC. There are 2 real models that we see when you study other treaties. And for anyone who's interested in this, we have done studies of about 6 treaties now. All of the studies that we do are on our website, fossilfueltreaty.org. Under resources, you can see a report looking at all 6 major treaties and what we can learn from them to create a fossil fuel treaty. So there's 2 types. The UNFCCC process is a consensus-based universal treaty. So what that means is fossil fuel incumbents, the countries right now who are planning on producing the most, the other countries have to reach consensus with them in order to create rules. So sure, you have 190 countries in the game, but what has it gotten us so far in terms of hard rules? Not a lot, because it's also not binding. Why is that? That's because Saudi Arabia put on the table decades ago the proposal that this be consensus and not by vote and non-binding. So instead, we're looking at models like the prohibition of nuclear weapons, the TPNW, where you have a coalition of like-minded states wanting to create a very high bar, clear rules that are high ambition. And so what we see with the nuclear example is that you didn't get Saudi Arabia joining, you don't get Russia joining, you don't get the US joining, still you don't. But the journey matters. The creation of that treaty, the creation of those rules, that shifted the social norm globally to what was acceptable in foreign policy. So the US is not stockpiling weapons today, even though they didn't sign. And so we need fossil fuel expansion to be seen for what it is, for what's killing us. And we need that to become acceptable, and it already is starting to, and that's in part because we've forced this conversation of transparency and accountability and science, even though apparently the president of COP28 doesn't know how to read the science. The science is clear in the IPCC, the IEA, and the Production Gap Report that we have to stop expansion if we want to ensure climate security. So that's the type of treaty that we're currently designing, and we don't expect them to join. On the fossil fuels are complicated. There's many players, kind of. Not really. Look at the Production Gap Report. There are 10 countries responsible for the majority of fossil fuel expansion that's planned between now and 2030. In fact, there is one country responsible for about 60% of the oil and gas expansion planned in the next 5 years, and that's the United States, in 2 states. So in fact, there are 2 subnationals, Texas and New Mexico, responsible for the majority of oil and gas expansion that will happen on this planet in the next 5 years. And if you take it down even further to companies, we know. We know who the companies are, we know who the people are, we know who the countries are, and it's not very many of them. The idea that we're all responsible for fossil fuel expansion, in fact, was a trick designed by BP decades ago when they created the idea of the carbon footprint. It's all of your use. You should all feel guilty. We're all dependent on it, so I guess you shouldn't advocate to have limits on it. Who has that benefited? It's benefited the fossil fuel industry. The most profitable industry on earth, $2.8 billion a day in profits for the last 50 years. And the profits went up this year. But the good news is, at this COP, fossil fuels have been dragged center stage, that we're finally having this conversation. We have pulled back the curtain on their denial, on their delay, on their lies, and their strategies and tactics. And that is part of a social norm shift. At Glasgow, we launched the first fossil fuel campaign. It was called Let's Say the F Words at COP. We're finally saying them here. And we're living that norm shift here. We just have to make sure it sticks with legal mechanisms. And yes, I support ecocide. If we have rules to stop expansion of fossil fuels, then we won't need a treaty. That's fine. What we are calling for is new global governance and legal tools, but we can't just assume that we can use the courts either. We need both. And we need international cooperation between countries as well, because we need debt relief so that countries aren't forced to drill more and frack more just to feed their debt. And that's where a lot of countries are right now. So I don't think we need one of them. I think we need both.
We have 5 minutes left for this session.
Thanks. Sorry.
I'm quite aware of this.
Had a lot of coffee.
Yes. I think we've answered these questions quite comprehensively. Let's give one more question here, and then I'm going to ask the others to respond. Please, sir.
I'll be very quick. So,
yeah, quick question, very
yes.
focused.
So Asim Zia, I'm a professor of public policy and director of Institute for Environmental Diplomacy and Security at University of Vermont. And my question is about great panel, really inspirational ideas. The question is why can't we take these argue that these organizations, fossil fuel suppliers, are climate criminals? I mean, I know there is a complex issue of intent in the international law. But why can't we simply make it as part of the non-proliferation fossil fuel treaty, make it part that they should be declared as climate criminals to begin with? And I think that would help a lot of the issues that we're dealing with here. Thank you. So if you have any comments about that. So first Jojo, then Inge, and last, but certainly not least, Vanessa, last comments, please, to this question.
The truth is that we can, and that's what a criminal law of ecocide does have the potential to address that, because it goes back to, it has to come to a particular act or a lack of an act. So the decision, one can envisage a point at which the decision to open a new coal mine or to start a new fossil fuel project in the light of all the public domain knowledge could constitute an ecocide. I mean, we imagine that initial cases would be likely to be direct pollution cases just because lawyers will want the jurisprudence to build up in a very clear way, but we can certainly foresee a time where that would be possible. And it's simply a different area of law. It's not mutually exclusive in any way. And also, the other thing I'd like to comment is that, and we get this a lot, these are great ideas. These are not just ideas, believe me. They are way beyond the idea stage, and that's what's encouraging.
Inga, if you may.
Yeah, I think let's not underestimate how things have shifted. I mean, to your point, Zephyr, we've used the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement as a very interesting model, which was really counter to everything else in the sense that it happened in under 5 years, and it was a very non-traditional combination of people and states that signed up for that, and Russia was the first signatory, ironically enough. So I think we're getting to that point where there is enough self-interest in some of this stuff to get it to happen. And I think ultimately nature will be the teacher, because already we're seeing nature as the teacher. So I think for me, we are at the cusp of something very interesting and very different. And we are beginning to make the law future fit. And it's thanks to pioneers like this who are doing that. And we ride in the slipstream of that and take the best of it and try and create something for the global commons that can be a precedent for the future. And I think, as I say, I think it is happening. It's so subtle, but it is happening.
Well, I'm not a legal expert, but I've seen that the power of the people in the past has made what seemed impossible possible. So obviously, I think there is a space on time where that could be possible, where the actions of fossil fuel industries would be criminal.
I think that's a good point to stop. Thank you very much. Let's give our audience panel a round of applause, please.